Cecil was a legend at the company. Handsome, impeccably built, but rumored to be a remarkably cold beta. Whispers always fluttered through the break room. Manager Cecil is so charismatic, even for a beta. Has an absolute workaholic machine. Probably going to marry the company. Angus rubbed the tip of his nose guiltily, his gaze slipping through the blinds to land perfectly on his boss, who was speaking softly on the phone. Cecil's voice carried a strange huskiness today. The sunlight caught the collar of his crisp black shirt. As he swallowed, a few deep red marks faintly showed on the pale skin of his neck. No one knew what kind of melting puddle this untouchable flower, who always presented himself as a frigid beta, would turn into during the inescapable magnetism of the midnight hours. 2 weeks ago, Angus and Cecil were just ordinary subordinates and superiors. That is, until a project went south due to Angus' oversight. And of course, it had to be a VIP client. Cecil got called into the boss office and chewed out so loudly that everyone could hear it through the door. The atmosphere in the manager's office was freezing. Angus stood across from Cecil, looking at his handsome, storm-clouded face, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Cecil. This incident is my responsibility. Discussing fault is pointless." Cecil cut him off, raising those sharp eyes to stare him down. He crossed his legs, tapping his long fingers against the desk, his tone icy. "Finish the revisions by today. I'll go negotiate with a client tomorrow morning." That single sentence anchored Angus to his desk until the stroke of midnight. Outside in the late-night corporate park, the cold autumn wind swept up dead leaves. Angus rubbed his throbbing temples as he walked out of the building. A dim street lamp cast a warm pool of light on the corner. On the edge of that light, a slender figure in a camel trench coat was curled up. It was dangerously cold to be passed out on the street. Angus hesitated for a moment before walking over, wanting to see if he could wake the guy up. The instant Angus got close, the very medium of the air shifted. Without any warning, the freezing chill seemed to be vacuumed away, replaced by a visible, soft white illusion of petals wildly blooming and spreading through the empty space. This jasmine pheromone, carrying a fatal attraction, wrapped around Angus' ankles with a gentle yet undeniable domination, climbing up his veins and instantly igniting a dark red flame in the depths of his pupils. It was an omega plummeting into heat. Angus' breath hitched. He bit down hard on his back teeth, his jawline tightening into cold iron. He desperately suppressed the screaming instincts in his body and stiffly looked down. The warm glow of the street lamp spilled unreservedly over the person's face. It was Cecil. Those normally shrewd, piercing eyes were now like a lake washed by spring rain, misted over with a wet haze. The corners of Cecil's eyes were flushed with a feverish pink, his long eyelashes fluttering fragilely like a dying butterfly. His thin lips were slightly parted. Every rapid, ragged pant dissolved into a wisp of white mist in the chilly night, intertwining with those phantom white petals and crashing straight into Angus' line of sight. "Angus?" The raspy end of his voice, laden with scalding moisture, nearly burned through Angus' taut thread of reason. Angus Adams' apple bobbed wildly, the veins on the back of his hand popping out one by one. "It's me." He forced down the darkening desire in his eyes, his voice turning heavy and hoarse. "Are you unwell? Do you need me to call an ambulance?" "No, don't." Cecil's long fingers suddenly clamped onto Angus' forearm. Even through the fabric, the staggering heat made Angus' palm tingle. Cecil gripped him so hard, his knuckles turned white. His eyes were full of pleading, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Help me to my car. No one can see me like this." A walk of less than 100 meters was stretched into an agonizing eternity by the dim night. When Angus finally managed to tuck him into the back seat, he braced his hands against the doorframe, his chest heaving. Beads of sweat slid down his nose and dropped into the shadows. He hunched over, like a wild beast tightly chained back, fighting the edge of a total meltdown alone in the dark. Inside the car, the amber streetlights sliced through the darkness of the back seat. Overwhelmed by the heat, Cecil tore off his trench coat and tossed it aside. He bit his lower lip hard to swallow down those sweet, trembling whimpers, but his upper body uncontrollably leaned forward, blindly fumbling through the glove compartment. "Medicine? I know I still have suppressants." With his frantic movements, the hem of his black shirt was dragged up, leaving a section of smooth, pale skin at his lower back, utterly defenseless in the faint light. That sliver of white was intensely striking in the dim cabin, glowing with an inviting luster like a piece of fine, warm jade. With a sudden rush, the string snapping in Angus' mind was deafening. By the time his vision refocused, his large, warm hand had already pressed seamlessly against that supple waist. The instant their skin touched, Cecil jolted like he had been struck by lightning, his spine going rigid, yet strangely, he didn't push away. Manager Cecil, the man in front of him, hadn't refused, and Angus' gaze deepened, his grip tightening ever so slightly. If you're out of suppressants, there is actually another solution. Cecil widened his watery eyes, his pupils shrinking as disbelief laced his voice. You knew? Wait, aren't you a beta? How could you? Angus stared at him intently, reaching up to touch the back of his own neck. With a flick of his fingers, he ripped off the long-expired scent blocker. Didn't you always say you were a beta, too? The moment the patch came off, the frantic, chaotic jasmine scent in the car was aggressively swallowed by a sudden velvety and deeply gentle milky aroma. It was an extreme visual contrast. No freezing snow or raging storms typical of an alpha, just a warm, rich glow like freshly poured milk. It carried a powerful healing presence that bit by bit smoothed over and absorbed all the anxious energy radiating from the Omega. This was Angus' secret, a formidable alpha who had no choice but to mask himself as a beta. Feeling this entirely different, yet perfectly compatible, warm domination, Cecil sharply turned his head away. A ripe flush instantly spread from the tips of his ears all the way down his long neck. Cecil. Angus leaned in, his broad shoulders crowding into the cabin and casting a complete shadow over the man before him. His tone softened, carrying an irresistible magnetism. Help me out. You've triggered my rut early, and like this, neither of us is making it home. A suffocating silence filled the car. After a long pause, Cecil, hidden in the shadows, ever so slightly fluttered his eyes shut. From between his trembling lashes, he squeezed out a whisper so faint it was barely audible. Make it quick. I still have a client meeting tomorrow morning. Inside the cramped cabin, the phantom white jasmine petals and the rich, milky halo intensely intertwined, finally melting in the rapidly heating air into a layer of warm, pale gold condensation that thickly coated the windows. The camel trench coat on the back seat was crushed into deep folds. Angus pinned Cecil completely beneath him, his canines roughly tearing open the buttons of that black shirt. Cecil's long fingers pressed fiercely against Angus' forehead, his knuckles pale from the strain. Couldn't you do this a bit more normally? My hands are full. Angus twitched his fingers, hinting at exactly where they were buried. The man beneath him lost his words, leaving only pants that grew heavier by the second. Angus' gaze drifted slowly down that pale jawline. The shirt was completely open. It wasn't the soft fragility usually found in an Omega. A layer of lean, fluid muscle heaved violently with his chaotic breathing, shimmering with a delicate, warm glow. Angus pressed his warm lips against that skin, pulling an irrepressible shudder from the man beneath him. Cecil twisted on the leather seat like a fish out of water, biting his lower lip as a fine blush burned all the way from the corners of his eyes down to his chest. When Angus tried to kiss his trembling lips to comfort him, Cecil jerked his head away, half of his face resolutely hidden in the shadows. Don't kiss. We aren't a couple. It feels weird. That single sentence instantly ignited the gentle milky glow into a boiling tide. The alpha instinct of having his territory rejected sparked a dark fire in Angus' eyes, burning away whatever patience he had left. He tightened his arms, trapping the struggling man deeply against his chest. If that's how it is, then let's go with your highly efficient method. Heat waves rolled as Angus fiercely bit into the fragile gland at the back of his neck. The scalding milky halo sank deep into the core of the pure white blossom like a dominant yet gentle blade. Cecil let out a short whimper, his physiological tears finally breaking the dam and dampening the leather seat beneath him. Early the next morning, the roar of the break room coffee machine and the co-workers' chatter about their perfect workaholic beta boss stretched into a fast-forwarded background hum in Angus' ears. He yawned, his palm pressing against the dull ache of the scratch marks on his back through his shirt. His phone screen lit up right on cue, popping up a cold directive. Angus, come to my office when you have a minute. Pushing open the half-closed glass door with the blinds, he stepped into the well-heated office. Cecil sat rigidly behind the mahogany desk. He had changed into a soft, pure black turtleneck sweater. The collar was perfectly snug against his jawline, completely burying every absurd red mark from the night before. Hearing footsteps, Cecil raised those sharp eyes, sweeping them quickly over Angus before locking them dead onto his computer screen. Sit. His vocal cords ground out an unusually raspy sound. After rapidly handing over the client feedback, Cecil closed his laptop. He laced his fingers together under his chin, his Adam's apple bobbing unnaturally twice. A ripe, flushed color visibly surfaced on his pale ears. You know everything there is to know now. Suppressants are becoming less and less effective for me lately. I want to sign an agreement with you. You give me a temporary mark on a regular basis, and I'll pay you. Manager Cecil, with your qualifications. Finding a partner wouldn't be hard. Why spend money on this? I have no interest in being someone else's partner. The light in Cecil's eyes turned cold. I'm asking you because you've also hidden your identity long-term. You can understand the difficulties. Angus stood up, his tall frame rounding the desk. With a warmth that brooked no refusal, he planted his hands firmly on Cecil's thin shoulders. Through the soft wool fabric, he distinctly felt the body beneath his hands go instantly rigid. I don't want your money. I need to save cash on suppressants, too. It's a win-win. Angus pulled his hands back and retreated to his spot, his gaze pressing closely on those flustered, dodging eyes. Where do we meet next? Cecil jerked his face away, avoiding Angus' gaze. Next weekend. My place. Cecil's apartment was exactly like the man himself, minimalist to the point of a paranoid neatness. Without the loss of control from their first time, their pheromones wove together in the dark bedroom into a warm, quiet sea of white gold. The storm settled, leaving only faint breaths drifting in the air. Angus clicked on the bedside lamp, and warm yellow light cascaded down. He threw back the covers and scooped up a limp, thoroughly marked Cecil into his arms. Angus, what are you doing? The man in his arms flailed as if electrocuted, gripping Angus' collar for dear life, a sheer pink still lingering at the corners of his eyes. Helping you clean up. Angus took long strides straight toward the bathroom. No need. I can do it myself. We aren't. Cecil's face instantly burned crimson, his knuckles white from gripping so hard. Yeah, I know. We aren't a couple. Angus gently lowered him into the pristine white bathtub. The warm water cascaded from the showerhead, washing over those mottled marks, while the rising steam painted the bathroom in a warm, hazy glow. Just think of it as me sucking up to the boss, all right? Over the patter of the water, Cecil squeezed his eyes shut. His long eyelashes cast fragile shadows over his cheeks, silently consenting to this boundary-crossing tenderness. It wasn't until Angus had cleaned everything up, put on his jacket, and walked to the entryway that a deliberately lowered, yet softly husky directive came from behind the doorframe. Thanks for the hard work. Every 2 weeks from now on, right here. Under the warm yellow light of the entryway, Angus let out a helpless sigh and flashed an okay gesture with his back to the door. It felt as if the bitter stench of his corporate grind had dissipated just a little within this warm, white gold glow. In the steam-filled bathroom, the warm yellow overhead light spilled softly onto the non-slip tiles. As the rhythm of their contract progressed, the prey who used to resist like a hedgehog would now lean exhaustedly against the edge of the tub, his eyes half closed, letting Angus' calloused fingertips brush over the water droplets on his collarbone. In the bedroom air, the pure white phantom petals of the Omega and the heavy milky halo were lazily intermingling and floating, like tea and milk at the bottom of a cup. 2 cups of jasmine milk tea, beaded with condensation, were placed next to the fresh, crisp bedsheets. Cecil frowned in displeasure, his long fingers forcefully piercing the seal with a straw. His voice carried that specific post-coital huskiness. Did you really have to pick this flavor? Angus sat on the edge of the bed, biting his straw with a soft grin, his eyes openly sweeping over that pale neck. Don't you think it fits the mood perfectly? Cecil rolled his eyes hard, turned over and pulled the blanket up high, not forgetting to coldly toss out an order to take out the trash. Angus chuckled and agreed. The door locked with a sharp click. Under the dim sensor lights of the hallway, the curve of Angus' lips plummeted instantly like a marionette with cut strings. The time it took to drink a cup of milk tea was already the most reckless overstepping of boundaries in this fake, mutually beneficial relationship. Once a person tasted sweetness, greed would grow wild in the dark like twisting vines. Of course, Angus could guess the reason Cecil fought so desperately to hide his identity. Countless fragments flashed through his mind. Cecil's gaze at the conference table, sharp enough to cut someone. The blinding radiance he exuded when leading the team to conquer new markets. These sharp traits never fit society's rigid, stereotypical assessment of a submissive, dependent Omega. But what did that matter? The film reel of his memories violently snapped back to a darkest hour years ago. Angus, fresh to the corporate world, was pushed to the forefront to take the fall for a disaster. He was surrounded by cold, evasive glares. Just as he was suffocating in panic, Cecil stepped firmly into his line of sight, blocking him. I trained Angus myself, and I double-checked the proposal. That back was so unyielding it seemed capable of blocking all arrows, hidden or overt. The situation needs further investigation, but I will take full responsibility. Angus stood frozen in the shadows when his phone screen suddenly lit up, casting a cold fluorescence on his reddened eyes. There was only a brief line of text on the screen. Don't worry, it can be fixed. Don't carry too much of the burden. In that moment, a fledgling bird had found a permanent haven. From that day on, Angus could never tear his eyes away from that figure. As long as Cecil could remain that proud, dignified, and untouchable boss, Angus would gladly do anything. Their 2-week routine was abruptly interrupted by a business trip. Sitting at his desk, Angus irritably twirled a signature pen, staring at the text on his phone. I don't have time. I have an important networking dinner tonight. He gritted his teeth and tapped rapidly on the screen. I'll go with you? If there's drinking, someone has to drive. In front of the hotel's luxurious revolving doors, the neon signs sliced through the night. Cecil arrived in a rush, briefcase in hand. The cold autumn wind had messed up his usually immaculate hair, and his eyes revealed an undeniable exhaustion from the road. Angus silently fell half a step behind him, his tall frame quietly blocking the brunt of the cold wind. Inside the private dining room, the crystal chandelier refracted harsh spots of light. A dozen unfamiliar faces sat around the circular table. At the head seat, Mr. Edgar swirled the amber liquid in his wine glass, his arrogant gaze sweeping the room as if inspecting merchandise. Wearing a flawless, professional fake smile, Angus' large, well-defined hands precisely intercepted every glass of wine offered to Cecil, throwing his head back and downing them in one gulp. 3 rounds of drinks in, the air in the room suddenly froze without warning. A highly aggressive, sharp illusion resembling black thorns exploded outward from the head of the table. It tore through the previously calm air, baring its fangs and spreading wildly into every corner with a suffocating domination. The gland at the back of Angus' neck stung sharply. His instinctual defense mechanism was instantly triggered. A small, incredibly faint but palpably thick milky halo spilled from his collar, tightly shielding his body and fending off the malicious invasion of the black thorns. The scene in the private room turned bizarre in a flash. The faces of the dozen alphas around the table all went uniformly pale. Colorful, sharply shaped phantom substances were forced out in the enclosed space, colliding, crushing, and repelling each other, sparking violently yet silently in mid-air. This was a high-tier alpha, using his instincts to conduct a naked obedience test, forcing everyone to know exactly what was happening, yet leaving them no choice but to pretend everything was fine under the heavy pressure. Through this grotesque visual storm, Angus coldly locked onto the source. Edgar sat at the head of the table, squinting and comfortably sipping his wine. His pupils reflected the desperately concealed but ghastly pale faces of the crowd, brimming with mockery and triumph. But for Cecil, who was an Omega, this was nothing short of a cruel, lingering execution. From the corner of his eye, Angus saw something that made his heart skip. Beside him, Cecil was trembling violently, entirely out of control. His usually stoic face was as pale as paper. Cold sweat dripped down the bridge of his straight nose and onto his plate. He bit his lower lip so hard that it lost all color, seeping a piercing crimson. Underneath the tablecloth, his long legs were shaking weakly, and the weight of half his body was already collapsing toward Angus. Under the oppressive visual dominance of countless irritated alphas around them, a trace of pure white, fragile petals symbolizing an Omega was desperately flickering at Cecil's collar, on the verge of being completely shredded by the surrounding thorns at any second. No one could be allowed to notice. Angus' pupils violently contracted. His jawline tensed into cold, hard iron, and the veins on the back of his hand bulged like coiled dragons. His gaze pierced through the aggressive, clawing black thorns in the air, locking dead onto the newly opened bottle of hard liquor in the center of the table. Without half a second of hesitation, his large hands snatched the cold glass bottle and raised it high toward Edgar at the head seat. Angus' facial muscles stiffly pulled into an exaggerated, overly flattering smile as he loudly spat out a few empty lines of sycophancy. Immediately after, he tilted his long neck back, and the searing amber liquid poured brutally down his throat like a waterfall. The agony of the hard liquor burning his esophagus instantly turned his eyes violently red, and the physiological tears from his coughing completely blurred his vision. The arrogant black thorns around them seemed to find an outlet, instantly dissolving into a chorus of grotesque, nauseating laughter. In this distorted uproar, Cecil's perfectly sculpted hands pushed through the crowd, clamping fiercely onto Angus' wrist and supporting him as they stumbled out, pushing open the heavy doors of the private room. The ghastly fluorescent lights of the restroom cast a glaring, cold sheen over the tiles. A stall door slammed shut with a brutal bang. Angus' stomach was churning. Utterly losing control of his strength due to the intoxication, he yanked Cecil so hard the man stumbled, pinning him heavily against the cold wall. In that instant, the phantom white petals could no longer be suppressed. They surged and exploded beautifully, yet desperately in the cramped stall. Cecil's eyes were filled with shattered, panicked light, his long, thick eyelashes trembling violently. He pressed his hands against Angus' scalding chest, trying to push him away, but his fingertips were so limp from the loss of strength that it felt like begging. "Angus, calm down. We can't do this here." Angus' chest heaved violently, his heavy pants echoing in the narrow space. With trembling hands, he fished a tiny, transparent glass syringe out of the inner pocket of his suit. Inside the glass tube flowed an incredibly high concentration, warm, and heavy milky glow. A soothing agent, made from my pheromones. Angus' tongue was numb, fighting back the shattering burn in his throat. Inject it into the gland. A reflection of that soft, milky white appeared clearly in Cecil's slightly dilated pupils. Without a shred of hesitation, he snatched the syringe and mercilessly plunged it into the fragile, soft tissue at the back of his own neck. The milky halo instantly spread through his bloodstream, acting like a warm tide that gently enveloped and devoured the pure white petals that had been on the verge of collapse. Gritting his teeth, Angus peeled off Cecil's coat. Then, with trembling fingers, he buttoned that black shirt all the way up to the very top, flawlessly concealing the flush on the back of the neck caused by the injection. "It got my scent on it. Don't wear it. Just say I threw up on you. Go, now." Cecil stared fixedly at Angus for 2 seconds. He turned around, rapidly adjusting his breathing in front of the restroom mirror. In less than half a minute, all the fragility and panic were wiped clean, and he draped that impeccable, flawlessly measured, aristocratic shell right back over himself. He returned quickly, wrapping the warm camel trench coat around the thoroughly battered Angus, his strong arms supporting most of the younger man's weight. The late-night car ride was dead silent. The warm amber halos of the street lamps swept past the windows, inching over Cecil's sharply defined, pale profile before slipping down onto Angus' exhausted brow. It looked like an old movie with a vintage warm filter, absurd, yet carrying a strange sense of peace. Feeling the lingering warmth of the hands on the back of his head from the back seat, Angus completely plummeted into darkness. When he opened his eyes again, his vision was filled with incredibly soft, warm yellow spotlighting from the ceiling. The pillowcase radiated a clean soap scent, woven with a few incredibly faint, quiet illusions of white petals that acted like a gentle hand, slowly smoothing away the stabbing pain deep in Angus' mind. He held his forehead and sat up. By the nightstand, Cecil was quietly keeping watch in a pool of warm light. Awake? Cecil stood up, bringing over a steaming bowl of hangover soup. Over the edge of the white porcelain bowl, the rising steam softened his usually sharp features into something extraordinary. The warm liquid slid down his esophagus into his stomach, ironing out all the discomfort. Beyond the sliding glass doors, the city's night view was a stream of glowing colors. The lights between the buildings morphed into an inverted sea of stars. The night breeze was cool as the two leaned shoulder to shoulder against the metal railing of the balcony. That soothing agent, Cecil looked out at the distant lights, his voice melting into the night. It must have cost a fortune to make. It really did. I only prepared one. Angus pressed his temples, not daring to look into the eyes of the man beside him. He was terrified of hearing a question that would draw a hard line between them. But Cecil merely lowered his eyelashes, casting a fragile shadow under his eyes. Angus. Cecil's voice was very soft, sounding exceptionally tender in the breeze. I always used to think that if I escaped the boundless discipline of my hometown, escaped the pointed fingers demanding that an Omega must be gentle and compliant, I could completely control my own life. He took a deep breath of the cool air high above the city, his handsome profile revealing an indescribable exhaustion under the starlight. I hid my gender, wrapping myself in strong armor in this massive city. But I realized that the nets dividing people still exist. The mesh is just better hidden. Every time I struggled through the dead of night relying on suppressants, I wondered if I was horribly wrong. Cecil slowly turned his head. Those eyes, which were usually unfathomable, now clearly reflected Angus' astonishment. Starlight, accompanied by a sudden, unguarded dampness, flickered in his eyes in the night. Luckily, in my most terrified, helpless moment, the person I met was you. Cecil gazed at him, the corners of his eyes curving into a very shallow, exceptionally beautiful smile. Thank you, Angus. Thank you for your help and your respect. Angus gripped the cold edge of the balcony, his fingers pressing so hard, his knuckles turned ghastly pale. His cowardly soul, which had to disguise even its instinctual halo as a Betis, was fiercely torn apart by this gratitude. He wanted to recklessly tear off this hypocritical mask of subordinate and superior. He wanted to ask if this thank you was the boundary that spelled his death sentence. But as 1,000 thoughts rushed to his lips, looking at those eyes full of exhaustion and trust, it all eventually dissolved into a bitter roll of his Adam's apple. You're welcome. Angus heard his own dry, hoarse voice echo in the night wind. Will we continue after this? Cecil let out an incredibly soft feather light. He turned around, leaving the balcony breeze and the starlight behind him. Angus buried himself deeply into the blankets scented with soft flowers, like an ostrich closing its eyes to escape reality. He didn't see that behind the study door. Just a wall away, his normally resolute and capable boss was leaning weakly against the wood. Long fingers tightly clutched the fabric over his chest as a barely audible whisper slipped out into the silent, dark night. I just need a little time to think. By unspoken agreement, neither Angus nor Cecil brought up that night's conversation again. But the project had to go on. Cecil requested the boss to hand over Mr. Edgar's project to someone else. However, since Cecil had always handled this account and they were at a critical juncture, the boss rejected the proposal. Angus drove Cecil and the boss to Mr. Edgar's company for a visit. While presenting the proposal, Angus kept his peripheral vision glued to Edgar's movements. The fluorescent lights in the conference room were ghastly and blinding. The projector's cooling fan buzzed, and the presentation on the screen had just been clicked off by Angus. Edgar leaned back in his wide leather chair, exhaling a cloud of pale gray smoke. Along with his malicious smile, sickening, sharp illusions of black thorns crawled like vipers along the underside of the polished conference table, creeping towards Cecil's ankles. His gaze shifted to Angus' boss. Mr. Gary, this is our first time working together, and I'm quite curious about your company culture. Edgar's gaze lingered stickily on Cecil's cold face. If we hadn't eaten together last time, I would have thought both of these gentlemen were Betis. The boss looked entirely shocked, while a layer of profoundly oppressive frost instantly covered Cecil's eyes. Angus' jawline snapped into a razor-sharp line. Suppressing his fury, he forced a professional, fake smile. Mr. Edgar, this is a personal matter. Let's return to the proposal. But Edgar smugly flicked his ash, pointing a finger through the air toward Angus with a scoff. An alpha, reeking of unweaned milk. It's a bit embarrassing, really. But with Manager Cecil's qualifications, it's such a waste to hide it every day. Is this playing hard to get the new trend? The phantom black thorns arrogantly expanded in the air. Edgar deliberately lowered his voice, his gaze blatantly explicit. Why work so hard? An Omega naturally has an Omega's advantages. Just like this partnership of ours, we'll have to rely on Manager Cecil in the future. There will be plenty of opportunities for in-depth communication, won't there? Screech, The chair legs scraped out an ear-piercing shriek against the polished tiles. Before those black thorns could even touch the hem of Cecil's trousers, Angus' fist, carrying a vicious gust of wind, mercilessly smashed Edgar's hypocritical face. Bang! Edgar and his chair flipped backward onto the floor. The conference room was instantly drowned in screams and the loud crash of overturning furniture. His eyes burning red, Angus grabbed Edgar by the collar, his knuckles raining down blow after blow. There was no hesitation, no cowardice, only the fully ignited fire roaring in his chest. That is, until a pair of dry, warm hands gently wrapped around Angus' bruised knuckles. Miraculously, the temperature of those hands instantly drained all the violence from Angus. Cecil stood amidst the wreckage, his back straight, his cold features devoid of any panic. His voice was steady, without a single ripple. I forgot to mention to Mr. Edgar that I have a habit of recording meetings. As for the sexist and sexually harassing remarks just made, you can weigh for yourself how it will impact your company's image if they get out. Excuse us. Angus, let's go. Cecil flipped his hand, interlocking his fingers tightly with Angus. Under the uproar and shocked stares of the crowd, they walked down the hallway. Angus looked down at their intertwined hands, the continuous warmth pouring from the palm making his eyes burn. Inside the car, the amber streetlights filtered through the windshield, spilling quietly over the two of them. Angus gripped the steering wheel deathly tight, his chest heaving, his voice dry and trembling. I'm sorry, I was too impulsive back there. This is my fault. Ilgo resigned to the boss. After all these years, how are you even sillier than when you first joined? The man in the passenger seat softly cut him off. Angus turned his head in astonishment, crashing into a pair of eyes brimming with a warm smile. Cecil wasn't blaming him. That subtle, soft curve at the corners of his eyes instantly broke through every defense Angus had built. I didn't know. Angus Adams apple-bobbed in pain, the corners of his eyes rimmed with a fragile red. I clearly didn't want to just stand behind you anymore. I wanted to make things easier for you, but I always mess it up. But I really couldn't stand him degrading you like that. When it comes to you, I'm losing control of myself more and more. But you didn't do anything wrong. Cecil turned sideways, his gaze as soft as a spring pool. You've always done remarkably well. His tone was too gentle, so gentle it sounded like he was comforting a clueless intern. Angus heard his own voice shaking. Don't coddle me. Don't comfort me. Don't use that tone with me. His voice cut off abruptly. Cecil leaned forward, his warm, soft lips precisely sealing away those fragmented words of self-blame. Angus' pupils dilated rapidly, staring stiffly at the handsome, elegant features so close at hand. That is, until a slight sting came from his lower lip. Cecil bit him punitively, and those eyes, which usually held such authority, now rippled with an indulgent tease. You're supposed to close your eyes when you kiss. Do I need to teach you that too? The wall sconces in the hallway stretched out two intertwined silhouettes. The warm light of the bedroom was shattered as the soft bed sank deeply beneath their outlines. In the air, the heavy milky halo representing the alpha acted like the warmest ocean current, completely enveloping and lifting the pure white phantom petals. Where the lights merged, there was no instinctual domination, only a lucid surrender and ultimate healing. Angus cupped that flushed face in his hands, his gaze tracing over every inch of Cecil's damp eyes and trembling eyelashes. At the crest of the wave, right as reason was about to be completely drowned by the surging light, Cecil's long legs wrapped tightly around Angus' waist, his pale fingers sinking deeply into his back. Cecil tilted his head back, his slender, fragile neck pulling taut into a breathtakingly beautiful arc, shattered pants slipping from his throat. Angus, mark me. I love your pheromones. I want to belong to you entirely. The night was deep, and the steam in the bathroom blurred into a hazy, warm yellow. Cecil stretched his limbs out, leaning lazily against the edge of the white porcelain tub, letting Angus gently wipe his faintly marked collarbone with a sponge. You've been holding back asking about my future plans for a while now, haven't you? Cecil's eyes were half closed, his voice carrying the huskiness of afterglow. Angus paused his movements, smiling helplessly. Yeah. So, what are you thinking? The company's direction has veered off track, and I can't influence the boss' decisions. Cecil opened his eyes, a calm, strategic brilliance shining in his watery gaze. I've saved quite a bit through investments over the years, and I have the network. I was planning to strike out on my own anyway. What happened today was, at best, a catalyst. He tilted his head slightly, looking at a dumbfounded Angus, the corners of his mouth lifting. So, it wasn't because you did anything wrong. Don't take the blame onto yourself. The final boulder hanging heavily in Angus' heart crashed to the ground. His eyes grew hot, his fingers unconsciously gripping the sponge tighter. Then, can I still follow you? Cecil flashed that familiar, helpless expression reserved for looking at an idiot. Marketing director. 15 months salary plus project bonuses. Double your current pay. How does that sound? Wild joy instantly surged into his chest. Angus leaned over, bracing his hands on either side of the tub, his deep blue eyes brimming with mischief. Then can I ask a follow-up question? In your new company, is it allowed for a subordinate to kiss the boss? Cecil let out a laugh of exasperation. He suddenly sat up straight, his pale arm hooking around the back of Angus' neck. With an irresistible magnetism, he pulled the man fiercely into the tub. Amidst the splashing water, Cecil straddled the fully soaked Angus, their warm breaths mingling in the soft light. The first rule in my corporate policy is a strict ban on office romances. However, his thumb ambiguously brushed against the corner of Angus' lips, his eyes sparkling with brilliant starlight. Once we go home, you can. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline was being dyed a remarkably tender peachy pink by the setting sun, casting a cozy, warm glow over the entire office. With a soft click, Angus' well-defined finger hit the enter key one last time. Across the desk, a manager who had jumped ship with them gave an exaggerated shiver, muttering under his breath, "Director Angus, our boss is still as ruthless as ever when he works. Huh. If you didn't submit that report today, would he really have exiled you to a branch office?" Angus helplessly rubbed his strong brow bone, but an indulgent smile rippled in his deep eyes. He zipped the files and sent them off, replying softly, "Yeah, has always been like this." Following the crisp notification tone of the successful email, the peachy pink sky outside completely melted into dazzling city lights. Angus stretched his long legs and pushed open the heavy frosted glass door to the CEO's office. Behind the massive mahogany desk, Cecil was slightly bowing his head. A pair of delicate gold-rimmed glasses rested on his straight nose. The lenses reflected the cold light of the computer monitor, tracing the flawless, cold jawline that looked straight out of a beautiful manhwa illustration. He was wearing a meticulously tailored, pure white crisp shirt today. His tie was pulled halfway loose, hanging lazily around his pale neck, exuding a tired, untouchable sex appeal. Hearing the footsteps, Cecil raised those sharp eyes. His long knuckles lightly tapped the desk, his cold voice breaking the hint of intimacy in the air. "Your report was awfully brief. Give me a break." Angus stepped right past the desk, his tall frame looming from behind to shadow both the leather chair and the man inside it. He raised his hands in surrender, a smile playing on his lips. "I churned that out working overtime back to back. The core details are all there anyway. Boss, don't sweat the small stuff, all right?" Cecil let out a displeased huff, but his furrowed brows slowly relaxed, and he didn't utter another word to kick him out. Angus chuckled aloud. His large, warm hands naturally rested on Cecil's tense shoulders, kneading them with just the right amount of pressure. Along with his soothing movements, a very faint, warm, and heavy milky scent quietly rippled into the air, bit by bit driving away the low pressure surrounding Cecil. "Oh right, I heard that Edgar guy went bankrupt. Hez buried in debt." Smack. Cecil backhanded the large hands off his shoulders, though his ears, soaked in that gentle, milky halo, uncontrollably flushed with a sheer pink. He pushed up his slipping gold-rimmed glasses, forcing a cold, hard tone. "If you spent the time you used to gossip on your reports, the final product would be a lot better. Next time, for sure." Angus dragged out the last syllable aggrievedly. His arms smoothly slid down, trapping Cecil perfectly in his embrace from behind. His broad, burning chest pressed tightly against that supple back, his voice dropping incredibly low, carrying a bewitching huskiness. "Let's call it a day, boss? It's Friday night. Didn't we agree that tonight we're going to Accompanying that low murmur, the previously quiet, milky scent instantly flared to life, gently yet dominantly wrapping the man behind the desk entirely. Almost at the exact same moment, several phantom pure white petals representing the Omega drifted softly from the crook of Cecil's neck, unguardedly dancing and intertwining with the milky glow. Cecil's breathing instantly lost its rhythm. That exquisite blush burned all the way from the tips of his ears down his long neck. He flusteredly averted his gaze, his long eyelashes trembling violently behind the lenses. However, the long-fingered hand resting on the mouse betrayed him, moving with absolute honesty toward the computer's shut-down button. The screen's light died completely. Inside the darkened office, the neon lights from outside cast large, ambiguous silhouettes. A glint of triumphant satisfaction flashed in Angus' eyes. He leaned down, his thin lips precisely capturing that incredibly red earlobe, his canines grinding gently with a punitive edge. The man in his arms let out a sharp, pitch-altered gasp. "Angus, how many times have I told you, not in the office?" "Oomph." The rest of his words were completely swallowed between their overlapping lips. Amidst a sea of brilliant white-gold pheromone light, Angus' muffled, entirely satiated chuckle rippled slowly through the cozy night. "But it's officially after working hours now, boss."
The story of Angus and Cecil concludes here. Cecil possesses an incredibly powerful charisma. In the workplace, he is a resolute, dignified, and proud workaholic beta who always shoulders the responsibility. In private, he is a strong, independent omega who dares to rebel against societal conditioning. In contrast, Angus' loyalty and restraint are equally moving. Although he is a naturally aggressive alpha, the underlying tone of his actions is one of ultimate gentleness. My absolute favorite plotline in the entire story has to be Edgar's deliberate harassment at the dinner party, followed by their heart-to-heart in the car and on the balcony. That sequence pushed the external oppression, the visualized clash of pheromones, and Angus' reckless protective instinct to their absolute peak. When Angus punched Edgar in the face without a second thought to defend Cecil, that counterattack, shattering all professional tolerance and acting purely on love and instinct, was incredibly satisfying. Yet, I'm greedy enough to want to see more of their daily office push and pull, those moments where they clearly care for each other but desperately cling to their boss-subordinate disguises, constantly testing the waters. The ending of the story is also exceptionally sweet. I hope Angus and Cecil stay this happy forever. Do you think Angus was right to punch Edgar in the face to defend Cecil?